Hey, what's up, everybody? It's David Draftbit, and we made some updates to how you configure endpoints for your API connections. So I'm going to run down all those changes with you and let you see what's new. Over here on the left, I'm going to open up the data modal, and this is where you can configure API services for your app. I already have one set up here, just a generic REST API using our example data. So this is the base URL for this test API. And then I've got my endpoints down here, two endpoints, create team and get teams, that we're going to take a look at. So opening up get teams, all this is still the same. I'm going to switch down here to the path section, paths and parameters. And this is where we start to see some changes. So previously, when you were setting up your path, you would put in your path. So I have /teams, and then also in the path, you can configure variables. So if this was an endpoint where I was fetching an individual record based on its ID, I could create a variable in this path here, and I can still do that as well. But what's changed is with query parameters. So you can see now the query parameters are in yellow or gold. So that is telling us that these are separate here from the path. And the way we configure that now is in the section below. We have a new query parameters section, and you've probably seen here already, we've got the limit here for the name, and this, we've also got a variable created here for the format of that. And this is where we get this preview from. So this is appended a query string and with a limit parameter, and passing a dynamic value using a variable. So in this format here, as we've seen, we can create a variable, obviously. If we wanted to hard code a value here, we could. So we could just leave it at 5. But we could also combine static values. So if you have some kind of special format that you need, you can combine variables and static data at the same time. One thing to note is there are a few reserved words. So var, this are not allowed, but pretty much any other word is going to work. Okay. The next thing is going to be required. So this will make it required whenever you're going to use the endpoint in your app. You want to think about, does my endpoint need to have this data in order to function? And in this case, no, the endpoint doesn't need a limit. It's an optional thing. So if I don't provide a limit query parameter to this endpoint, it just sends me a default number, either all of them or 10 or whatever. But in cases where you definitely need that value, like in the case where we had an ID, if our endpoint is specifically returning a record by its ID, then that endpoint definitely needs an ID in order to do its work. So in that case, we could make that required. But in this case, we don't want to make it required for a limit. So heading down to headers, there's only one update here. We've made it so that you can pass in a value from your global variables. So for instance, if you have an auth token saved to a device variable for testing, like a test auth token, you can pass that in here to an authorization header, for instance, rather than having to hard code that value in here and then rotate it out, as it expires or whatever. So that's all with headers. And then there's this new section here for variables, and this is tied to those variables that get created here and pass some parameters. So if I had left that ID in place there, down here in the variables section, we would have ID and limit. So this is that limit. And then we can pass a test value here. And also, just like with the headers, you can select a variable. So if you have a global variable that's set to a number that you want to use, you can do that as well. And then it's showing you here on the right where that parameter is coming from. So if you add one to path, it will say path as the source. So it just gives you kind of an idea so you can know where that data is associated with. And then down here in the test section, This is that base URL. And then we've got /teams, that's our path. And then you can see actually I left a slash in there, so let me remove that. And so you can see here the query parameter has been added and then that default value of 5. And so now when I make my request, I get back an array of 5 teams. And then obviously I can change this value. Also becomes the default value for the endpoint. So whenever you're using this endpoint around your app, if you have like a sensible default that you want to provide, you can do that. Since this variable is not required, I can just clear this out totally, and it won't even be included in the test endpoint, right? So if a variable that's in the path or the query string is not required and you do not pass a value to it, it will not be included in the request at all. So definitely use required in the case where you have something that's required. Okay. So what's next? We can move on, I think, to create team. And in this case, just one thing that I need to show you, which is this request is actually making a post request. So it's not making a GET request. Typically, you don't use query parameters in a GET and a post request. Sometimes you do, but mostly you're going to have stuff in the request body. So this is just JSON data that is going to be sent along with your request. And in the case of my teams, if I'm creating a team and I know that I definitely don't want to create a record without having a name value passed to it, we've introduced a way for you to make these required as well. So you can see I added a exclamation point or a bang or whatever you want to call it to the end here, and that designates this variable as required. And so just like those path parameters, when we created a variable, they showed up in this variable section. Down here, they show up as well for the request body. So name, that's our name from the request body. And then I'm passing it in a value here, concierge, and you can see the source is telling me that it's from the body, and then in this case it's required. So if I cleared that out, it would tell me, hey, no, we need that. So let's go ahead and test this out, and you can see now we've created a new record with our concierge. All right, so that really covers all the updates for endpoints and setting those back up. If you want more detailed information, the docs for REST API endpoints has been updated with all this information about how you can set the query parameters, the request body, required parameters, and all that. So definitely check out the docs for a more in-depth look, and I'll see you in the next video.